Ever had to stand up to someone everyone else feared?
My mom had cornered me in the kitchen just before everyone started arriving, her voice sharp and urgent, the kind of tone that didn't allow for negotiation, telling me I needed to keep quiet during Ryan's big night, that this dinner wasn't about me, that I shouldn't ruin his moment the way she was convinced I always tried to do, even though all I had ever done was live in the shadow of the child she worshipped while quietly swallowing every unfair cut she dealt me over the years. She put her hand on my arm, pressing harder than she usually would, almost like she was scared I might slip away before agreeing, and she begged me not to make a scene, not to let the bitterness she swore I carried spill out in front of the guests. I looked her in the eye, hearing her call me dramatic, hearing her tell me people don't like when personal issues get dragged into the open, and I promised her I would sit there, smile when expected, and let Ryan enjoy his engagement without interference. Because deep down I didn't want to be painted once again as the jealous sister who couldn't stand seeing him shine. The dinner was set up exactly the way you would expect it when my parents wanted to make Ryan look like the golden boy, every detail carefully arranged to impress Emily's family, who were polite and soft-spoken. The kind of people who probably had no idea that behind the warm introductions and clinking glasses there was a long history of favoritism, manipulation, and cover-ups that no one ever wanted to talk about. I sat there quietly, feeling like an outsider even though I was supposed to be part of this family, trying to remind myself that my promise meant I needed to get through just a couple of hours without letting the truth slip. Even though it burned in the back of my throat with every polite toast and every exaggerated story about Ryan's successes. Ryan played his part perfectly, charming everyone, joking in the way that always made my mother beam with pride, and I caught myself clenching my hands under the table as I thought about all the things he had done that no one in that room knew about. All the times I had been forced to pick up the pieces of his mistakes while he walked away untouched. I was going to stay quiet. I really was, and I repeated that to myself every time I felt the urge to correct him, to cut through the lies with the blunt edge of reality. It was Emily who changed everything. She was sitting to my right, her smile never faltering, her posture perfect, her laugh in the right places, and I thought she was just another person fooled by Ryan's performance until I felt her hand slip under the table and take mine. It startled me, and I turned my head slightly, confused, and that's when she leaned in just enough so only I could hear her whisper, "I know what he did." My heart jumped, because those words meant she wasn't in the dark the way I thought. She wasn't blindly buying into his story, and for the first time in years I felt like maybe I wasn't the only one carrying the weight of his secrets. The promise I had made to my mother replayed in my head, but Emily's whisper cracked it open like glass under pressure, and I realized that silence wasn't protecting anyone except the person who least deserved it. I tightened my grip on Emily's hand, steadying myself, and then I felt something shift inside me, a decision forming that no amount of begging or guilt could stop, because if Emily already knew part of the truth, then it was time for the rest of the room to hear it too. I let go of her hand slowly, pushed my chair back just enough to be heard without rushing, and I cleared my throat. The sound cut through the laughter and chatter like a knife, and when every head turned toward me, I knew the moment my mother feared had arrived, the moment when I would no longer play the role of the silent sister who swallowed the truth to keep the peace. Because this time I wasn't protecting Ryan, and I wasn't protecting her. When the room finally settled after my throat cleared and the fork stopped moving and the smiles softened into that careful attention people give when they sense something honest, but inconvenient, is about to arrive, I decided to make it sound like gratitude because that was the only way anyone at that table would hear me without throwing up a wall, so I lifted my glass and said I wanted to thank Ryan for teaching me, better than any boss ever could, what it looks like when someone takes what is not theirs and calls it leadership, and while a few people laughed because they thought I was joking, Emily did not laugh, my mother did not laugh, and my voice did not shake. I told them that my first full year at the family business had been the kind of grind you do when you still believe effort will fix what politics has broken, that I built a pitch from the ground up, that I chased data the way most people chase sleep, and that the morning we were supposed to present together, Ryan sent me home to polish the appendix, while he swung by the client for a quick hello, then walked in alone with my deck, my research, my talking points, and walked out with applause. And a contract that had his name stapled to the story of my work. I said that a month later the payroll cutbacks came, that my name landed on the list while his got a promotion party, that my mother told me to be graceful and not burn bridges because the world is small, and that I swallowed it. I smiled. I wrote the thank you notes, and I tried to move on, only the world kept shrinking every time I had to hear my project retold as Ryan's strategic vision, by people who would never know the difference unless someone handed them the receipts. I explained that when I finally accepted layoffs as a blessing in disguise, I sent a polite message to the client who loved Ryan's deck, wishing them well and offering to answer any lingering questions about the model I had built. And that a senior manager replied with a thoughtful note that began with confusion and ended with something close to embarrassment, because buried in their thread was a version of my file with my initials in the metadata and a timestamp that never once matched the story Ryan told at the office. I said that I brought copies for anyone at the table who preferred paper to promises, and I reached into my bag and pulled out a neat stack of envelopes with names on the front, not to humiliate anyone but to keep the usual fog from rolling in, because paper has a way of making people sit up straighter than memory ever does. I handed one to Emily, one to her parents, one to my father, and I kept one for myself, and for a long second the only sound was paper lifting and the tiny pause a person takes when they recognize a header from a firm that does not joke. And I watched Ryan try to smile through it while my mother began to shape my name in that warning tone she uses when she wants me to become smaller before the room notices I am standing my full height. I kept going because I had learned that if you stop at the first denial, the story gets rewritten before dessert, and I told them that after the layoff I had filed an ethics inquiry at the company where Ryan now wore a shiny title. Not because I wanted his job, but because I wanted my name back, and that 2 weeks ago I received a letter stating that the firm had confirmed material misrepresentation of authorship on a legacy account and had initiated a review of his conduct. Effective the next business day. I read the line that said temporary suspension with pay pending completion of the review, and I said plainly that I did not ask for anything slower or softer than the truth, and that whatever they decided would be theirs to own, but that tonight, in this room where everyone loves a story about hard work and loyalty, I was not going to pretend it was an accident that my work disappeared from my hands and reappeared in his. I turned to Emily and told her I did not bring this to ruin her night, that I brought it because she had taken my hand and told me she knew, and because knowing alone can make a person crazy while the liar keeps laughing. And her mouth pressed into a line that looked like relief and anger holding each other up, which is a look I know too well. My mother started to say that families handle things privately and that good sisters do not sabotage good men, and I told her that a good sister does not carry a secret that keeps another woman trapped in a future built on theft, and if she wanted privacy, she should have started the day her son decided the truth was optional. I set my glass down and said that this, believe it or not, was the gentle part, that I had started here because work is only money and time while the next part is about trust, and that I would like a minute to breathe before I kept my promise to be fully honest. Then I looked at Emily, who did not flinch, and I asked, as the room held its breath, whether she wanted to go first or whether she wanted me to finish what I started. I could feel the room trying to recover its balance after the envelopes began their quiet circulation, the way people glance at one another to test whether they are supposed to be outraged or grateful or simply entertained by family drama dressed up as a toast. And because I knew that if I left it at professional theft, the older relatives would file it under sibling rivalry and a teachable moment about boundaries, I took a slow breath and said that while stealing my work explained how Ryan looked so polished at meetings, it did not explain why Emily had taken my hand under the table like a person who was bracing for impact rather than applause, and if we were going to be honest as a family, then honesty could not stop at spreadsheets and titles because the contract Ryan signed with Emily did not have a quarterly review or a public relations team to spin the fallout. I said that when Emily first came around, I liked her immediately for the way she listened without trying to solve you, and I added that I had stayed quiet for a long time because I had wanted her to have the version of love she thought she had bought into. Yet the problem with pretending not to see is that your body still keeps score. So when my stomach flipped a year back after a late call from an unfamiliar number that asked for Ryan and then hung up when I answered, I did the thing women do. When we feel the floor tilt under our feet, which is not to storm in with accusations, but to watch carefully, to notice the uncharged phone tucked into a gym bag, the two cleansed message threads that still left notification shadows, the hotel loyalty email that landed in a shared inbox our mother set up long ago, and the receipt that put a midweek dinner at a place Emily hates on a night Ryan swore he was stuck in traffic. I said that before I opened my mouth tonight, I had verified enough times to stand in a courtroom if I had to, that the messages existed with full timestamps and geotags, and that the name attached to most of them was not some anonymous fling in another city, but a woman Ryan and Emily both knew from a circle that should have been safe. A woman who had sat across from Emily at a charity brunch and complimented her ring while scheduling a getaway for the following weekend with the man who put that ring on her hand. And while I agreed that people can make mistakes and grow, there is a difference between a mistake you confess and a pattern you build like a second house you are furnishing room by room with lies. My mother said my name the way a person says the word stop at a crosswalk they cannot control, and I told her I was not dragging strangers into our dinner because I was not interested in public shaming for sport, that my aim was not cruelty but clarity. And that clarity sometimes looks like evidence you cannot argue with, which is why I had already asked the restaurant to set the small screen behind the bar to our slideshow for after dessert. Only the slideshow would not be the montage Ryan sent the planner with childhood photos and buddy shots from college. It would be a timeline coded in plain language that anyone in the room could follow. A tidy sequence of calendar entries and location pings and overlapping reservations tied to the second phone account I had paid to recover through the carrier's archived billing portal with Ryan's full consent, because he had handed me his wallet last month when he wanted me to pick up his dry cleaning, and because I am not careless with other people's property, I returned everything except the one detail he never imagines matters, which is that a number on a card and a signature scribble can loosen doors he assumes are locked. Ryan told me I was sick, that I was jealous, that I had orchestrated an ambush on a night meant for love, and I answered that jealousy is a hollow thing compared to the solid weight of a woman's time. That love does not ask a person to sit obediently while her future is negotiated on the back of another woman's dignity, and that if he wanted gentleness, he should have given it when it counted, because tonight I was fresh out of soft edges. I turned to Emily and said I would hand her the file and the passcode and the contact for the person at the carrier who handled the retrieval so she could own the decision rather than live on second-hand knowledge. And I told her that on page 6 there was a screenshot from the message thread where the other woman confirmed, in her own words, that the first time was months into the relationship rather than years before, which meant all the apologies about youthful phases and harmless flirtations were not only thin but upside down. Then, because revenge that actually closes a door needs one simple act that cannot be spun into gossip or pity, I raised my glass toward the bar and caught the bartender's eye. And the screen that had been waiting blank lifted into the first slide with a header that did not accuse anyone of anything, but simply read a short phrase about dates and locations. And while people turned toward it with the curiosity they usually reserve for baby photos and high school haircuts, I leaned to Emily and said that the slideshow had no names and no faces, but only the truth arranged in the order it happened, and that I would stop it with one gesture if she told me to, and she did not tell me to. The first map dot appeared beside a dinner check that matched the timestamp on Ryan's calendar entry for a late client meeting, and the second slide layered hotel key access logs against a rideshare drop-off tag. And while a few relatives shifted uncomfortably like churchgoers who suddenly recognize the sermon is about them, Emily's father inhaled through his nose and kept his eyes on the screen the way a man does when he understands the conversation has moved past opinion and into math, and Ryan, finally understanding the shape of the floor beneath him, reached for the remote that was not on the table because I had already handed it to the maitre d'. I said that this was where we paused for air because no one thinks well when their face is on fire, and that if Ryan wanted to explain, he could do it in full sentences with everyone listening. Only before he spoke I turned to my mother and told her we were about to discuss her part, not in the affair because for once she had the luck of innocence there, but in the way she had taught him to hide damage rather than repair it, which is the habit that made everything that followed possible. And as Ryan started to sputter, I placed my hand gently on Emily's wrist and asked the question I had been saving since the moment she took my hand under the table. The question that would make the entire room sit still. Was it the cheating that made you squeeze my hand? Or was it the accident you found in the old insurance files you emailed me last night? Emily did not answer right away because the kind of answer that changes the temperature of a room takes a second to find its footing. So she looked at the screen for a long breath and then back at me and said that while the cheating mattered and while the humiliation of it would take time to wash off, the reason her hand clamped around mine under the table like a lifeline had nothing to do with hotel key logs or secret dinners, that it had everything to do with a file buried inside a renewal packet from an old carrier where Ryan had kept a dormant policy as a kind of financial souvenir from his early 20s. A packet she opened only because a spam filter hiccup dumped a pile of archived notices into her inbox, and because she has the kind of brain that clicks through everything before deleting it. At which point she found an endorsement memo and a claim note in an adjuster's handwriting that referenced a late-night single-vehicle incident with a possible secondary impact on a parked car and a notation that the insured was not the listed driver on the police report even though the telematics on the vehicle, which was a fancy way of saying the little black box the dealership installs to save money on premiums, placed Ryan behind the wheel for the hours that mattered. I watched my mother reach for her water in the kind of motion a person uses when they need their hands to do anything except tremble, and I said for the room, which had begun to buzz the way a hive sounds when someone has knocked on the wood, that the incident in question had been quietly patched with cash and favors, that the parked car belonged to a nursing student who was working a late shift and came outside to find her bumper kissing the ground while the streetlight camera misfired, and the responding officer wrote an incident number that never made it into a searchable database because a supervisor marked it as resolved after a friendly call from the lawyer my parents keep on speed dial for business disputes. A lawyer who billed the damage as a private property matter and encouraged everyone involved to avoid the headache of formal statements in exchange for a private settlement and a rental for a week. I said that if anyone wondered how such a thing becomes a family secret rather than a community story, they could ask my mother, who arranged the body shop after hours through a church acquaintance, who coached Ryan to say he had lent the car to someone whose last name he could not remember, and who signed the extension letter that allowed the claim review to time out before the carrier could reconcile the telematics with the report because young men deserve a clean slate and nothing truly bad happened. Which is a sentence that sounds reasonable until the nursing student opens a bill for physical therapy after a delayed back flare and realizes the private settlement was light by a few sessions and the person who caused the problem has already moved on to a new apartment and a new story. Ryan tried to interrupt with the line he always uses, that this is ancient history and that every family has a few dents they do not need to parade through a dining room, and I said that history is not ancient to the person still paying for it, which in this case meant a woman who had to pick up extra shifts to cover what our family chose not to include, and that the only reason we were discussing it at an engagement dinner was because the pattern matters more than the episode, because the pattern is a man who does a thing and then looks for a woman to carry the consequence. First our mother, and then me, and now the woman he says he intends to love for the rest of his life. And that if Emily was going to sign her name to him in front of witnesses, then she deserved more than a highlight reel and a cake. My father, who had stayed quiet so long I forgot he was at the head of the table, finally cleared his throat and said that perhaps the details could be revisited another day because tonight was supposed to celebrate the future. And I told him the future was exactly what we were handling because a person's future is made up of the bills he dodges and the truths he refuses to file under his own name. And if the room wanted something constructive, they could know that the nursing student had been reimbursed in full as of last week because I tracked her down through the repair shop's records and sent her what she should have received the first time plus interest rounded up, which I did not announce earlier because charity is not what this is and because paying a debt you did not create is not noble. It is simply the cost of ending a lie that keeps breeding new ones. Emily's mother asked, in the careful tone of someone who is still willing to be surprised by the best in people, whether Ryan had ever apologized privately, and I answered that he had apologized the way he always does, by saying he had been under stress, and that the timing was bad and that he wished the whole thing would just go away, and that what he calls apology is a request for silence with a bow on top. And that I understand now why my mother has always been so good at granting that wish. Because silence lets you pretend the house is sturdy when the beams are hollow. I turned back to Emily and said that if she chose to walk away tonight, I would walk her to her car and make sure she reached home without anyone following. Not because I thought Ryan would do something reckless in a parking lot, but because I have learned you do not take chances with a man who has already practiced choosing himself over everyone else. And I added that if she chose to stay, I would not judge that either, because leaving is not a performance for an audience, it is a decision a person makes when the ground under their feet finally speaks louder than the faces around a table. And she nodded in a way that told me she heard every word even if she could not use them yet. Then I set my napkin down and said that while accidents and affairs might be survivable in the hands of two adults who want to repair something honestly, what usually kills a future is not the tearing, but the theft that follows. The theft of time and money and understanding, and that before anyone decided where they stood, I had one last folder that needed daylight. A folder about statements and transfers and a savings account that Emily believed was a shared ladder for their first home, and that Ryan had quietly turned into a parachute, and I asked the room if they preferred truth now or truth later as the bartender lifted his hand for my signal and Emily finally whispered that she was ready for everyone to see exactly where the money went. The room did not need the bartender's signal once Emily nodded, because the air itself seemed to tilt toward the truth as if it had been waiting in the walls for permission to speak. So I said that the last folder would look less dramatic than the slideshow of maps and key logs and receipts, yet it would be the one that mattered most for the path Emily would walk after tonight. And I explained in plain language that the transfers were not random mistakes or rounding errors, but a slow siphon, executed with the precision of a person who believes small thefts are invisible if you keep them under the threshold of outrage. That the withdrawals arrived as drips labeled with boring names like service adjustment and provisional sweep, and that they moved not into a personal checking account in Ryan's name, which would be too obvious, but into a brokerage sub-account nested under a family entity he had revived from a college project and renamed with initials that looked like an investment club, and that each move came a few days after Emily's direct deposit, as if every paycheck of hers was an alarm clock for his entitlement. I told them I had not hacked anything or played spy beyond my appetite for thoroughness, that Emily herself had forwarded the notices weeks ago along with screenshots of balance discrepancies she could not reconcile, and that I had matched those numbers against public filings and merchant data to show the money flowing into the shell where it earned quiet interest while Ryan told her they needed to tighten up for a future mortgage. And I added that the ring on her finger had been paid down from the same pool with a store credit line guaranteed by her excellent score, which meant that every compliment she received on that stone was another little tax she paid on his ego. And that if anyone in the room wanted to call this a misunderstanding, they would have to explain why a misunderstanding signs its own name to recurring transfers and then renames them to look like bank housekeeping. My mother started to say that couples handle budgets in their own way and that rearranging savings is not a crime, and I said she was right that not everything is a crime, and that sometimes the law is not the only measure that matters. But for the record, there were signatures on file that did not belong to Emily authorizing the sweep to the brokerage, and there were consent boxes ticked at times when she could prove she was sitting in a classroom leading a volunteer workshop with her phone locked in a cabinet, and that while I was not a prosecutor, I had already walked these pages through a fraud officer who did not smile and did not shrug, and who offered a simple path for remedy that Emily could trigger the moment she chose to reclaim her future. A path that began with a freeze and continued with a forensic audit of every transfer since the account opened, followed by a reversal where possible and a report where necessary. I turned the folder toward Emily and slid a single card across the table with a name she already knew because we had met her together last week when Emily wanted to check whether her instincts were fair or paranoid. And I said that if she pressed the call button now she would not need to raise her voice or explain the dinner or survive a scene in the parking lot. That the officer would mark the account as restricted and would require Ryan to appear in person with identification for any movement of funds, and that from that point on every dollar would leave a trail Emily could follow without asking anyone for permission. Ryan laughed the way people do when they are frightened and need the sound of their own bravado to feel like armor, and he said that we were all making a meal out of paperwork, that he had planned to consolidate the money after the engagement party as a surprise toward a down payment, that I had poisoned his fiancée and humiliated our family, and that none of this would matter once everyone slept on it. And I told him that sleep never cured a person of being found out, that morning light simply makes the stain easier to see, and then I looked to Emily, who did not blink, and I asked whether she wanted me to make the call or whether she would like the satisfaction of doing it herself. She lifted her phone with the small steadiness of someone who has decided to stop apologizing for wanting a fair life, and she pressed the button and stated her name and the account details, and the phrase she had practiced under her breath in my car earlier in the week. And the officer must have recognized the exact case number because the conversation was brief and unemotional and ended with a confirmation that the account was now restricted and that a fraud claim had been opened in her name, with follow-up steps arriving by email within the hour, after which Emily put her phone down like it weighed less than it had a minute ago and folded her hands in her lap as if to keep them from shaking, only they did not shake. My father asked, very softly, what came next, and I answered that what came next was not a public trial or a shouting match, that what came next was simple and administrative and, therefore, merciless. Because forms do not get tired and they do not make excuses, and I said that an ethics update had already gone to the firm that had suspended Ryan pending review with the documentation we discussed earlier, that a courtesy packet had been delivered to the board member who sponsors his current project so they would not accidentally vouch for him on an upcoming certification, and that a plain letter without adjectives had been sent to the woman from the brunch. Not to shame her, but to close the loop with dates and times so no one could pretend they were confused about how much of Emily's life had been borrowed to fund a romance where she was not invited. I turned then to my mother and said that I would not carry her silence any longer, that I would visit her on a different day if she wished and listen to anything she wanted to say about the choices she made when she thought love meant hiding evidence, but that tonight I would not soothe or soften for the sake of decorum, and I told her that if she needed to leave with Ryan I would understand, and if she wanted to stay and finish dinner with Emily's parents I would understand that too, because the era of me choosing for everyone had ended the minute Emily took my hand and told me she knew. Emily stood, and for a heartbeat I expected a dramatic speech or a throne ring or some gesture that would satisfy the table's need for a finale. Yet she simply thanked my parents for the meal, apologized to the guests for the interruption, turned to Ryan without a tremor and said that she would not be marrying him, that she would pursue restitution through the proper channels, and that any further communication should come through counsel, after which she looked at me as if we were already down the block in our coats, and I stood too because there was nothing left to perform. We walked toward the door as the screen behind the bar went dark and the envelopes sat in neat little stacks beside half-finished glasses, and when the night air met us it felt like a hallway rather than a wall, and Emily laughed once without joy and then exhaled. And I said that tomorrow would be boring and bureaucratic and that this was a gift because boring holds better than fury, and she said that she had been bracing for pity and had found a plan instead, and that while the whole thing hurt in the precise ways betrayal always hurts, she felt like someone had handed her the keys to her own life again and told her she could drive wherever she wanted without asking for permission. I do not know what Ryan did after we left, and I do not need to know, and I am not interested in wishes for his redemption any more than I am interested in predictions of his collapse, because what mattered to me was simple and immediate and complete, which is that the woman he expected to keep quiet did not keep quiet, the money he expected to keep moving no longer moved, The job he expected to glide through now asks him questions he cannot answer with charm, and the mother who expected me to keep the family's peace will have to make a new kind of peace with a daughter who finally chose the kind of fairness that does not ask for applause, and if anyone at that table wonders whether this went too far, they were not the person counting the cost every week while a liar called it love.